It is a real lesson for the digital age. Online, people can be anyone they pretend to be. I want you to listen to this. American writer Tom McMasters, here he is in this broadband interview. He made up a whole new identity. He purported to be a gay Syrian American woman. And people, the world was enraptured by this blog. He called it a gay girl in Damascus. And his fake identity, he called himself, or I should say herself, Amina, inspired readers who followed along as she joined these protests against Syria's leaders and took personal risks like having romances with women, and it all turned out to be a big lie. Or if you check the blog today, it's huge type, it says a big hoax. People are furious now, all kinds of fallout today. Some of the gay communities say Tom McMasters risked their own safety and harmed their cause, and the journalist who really helped uncover this whole thing is this guy, Andy Carvin. He is a senior strategist over at NPR. And Andy, it is a pleasure to have you on. We've been following your Twitter. I know my EP followed you all weekend and said we've got to get this guy on. So many journalists chase this story down the rabbit hole. Not you, Andy. When did you start smelling something fishy?
It was a crazy week. I was never really a full-time reader of the blog, though I certainly knew of it. There aren't many high-profile bloggers coming out of Syria, let alone doing it in English. But she drew a lot of attention. I mean, just the name alone, a gay girl in Damascus, is going to be a compelling read. And as it turns out, she was a good writer as well. But not too long after word got out on Monday that supposedly she had been kidnapped, I began hearing from sources of mine in the Syrian community, including some gay Syrians, and not only were they skeptical of her stories, they weren't totally convinced she existed either. So I just started asking questions on Twitter and Facebook. Have any of you met her in person? Do you know her at all? And the more I asked, the less I learned, because no one had met her. Not even the reporters who had supposedly interviewed her in person. They hadn't done that either. It was all done through text relationships only.
Alas, she is a he. Tom McMaster, 40-year-old American, been posting under this called him Amina since 2006. Seems to me, reading his apology today, he's a fiction writer, a wannabe fiction writer, perhaps with a penchant for Middle Eastern issues. What have you learned about him? Yep. And by the way, what have you also learned about the photo? Who was the woman this woman? Who is she?
Well, let's start with that. As the story began to unravel early last week, the Wall Street Journal and other news organizations started reporting that there was this woman in London, a Croatian woman named Jelena Lecic, whose ex-husband, I believe, saw the photo on a website after Amina had been, quote-unquote, kidnapped. And he alerted Amina, and she started contacting news organizations saying, take my face off your websites. That's me.
Zero connection.
And the BBC finally interviewed her.
Zero connection to this whole story.
Never met her.
Tom McMaster, who is he?
Possibly 100. Yes. From what we can tell, he's originally from the Atlanta area, and he's currently studying at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, focusing on medieval studies, Byzantine studies, in fact. And so it appears at some point over the last 5 years he was interested in doing this online experiment, trying to push the boundaries between truth and fiction, and it just grew and grew and grew. And now we have Amina essentially fooling everyone who had followed her up to this point.
Sue, I know that you have dissected this guy sort of inside out. His execution was poor. He says his intentions were good. I listened to this interview. I also read part of the mea culpa on the blog, and I want to read just part of it. He said, my intentions were good. I got carried away. I owe apologies to those I hurt and will do all in my power to make things right. I only wanted to set forth real information through the use of artfully crafted fiction. I was too successful and I was too caught up in what I was doing. I ignored the consequences of my actions. So, Andy, here's my question to you. His intentions really were to illuminate this story of the Syrians for a Western audience. Do you think at all, though, he makes a point, given the fact that Syria, let's be honest, not always above the fold?
Well, I think that is an important point, because news organizations around the world are struggling to get quality information out of Syria. And this seemed to have started as an experiment. And in some ways, he just ended up in a very lucky situation, from his point of view at least, that Syria suddenly found itself in the middle of a rebellion. So he upped the ante and created the blog around this character. And so it certainly brought attention to Syria, but it also brought a lot of people at risk, because there are protesters all over the country, especially members of the local gay community, who've spent the last week very, very scared that this was some form of intelligence op or something else that could have gotten them killed.
Andy Carvin, a fascinating article on your website, NPR. You can follow Andy at A Carvin just to sort of read through the deconstruction of this blog today. Andy, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Brooke.
Coming up next.